Welcome everybody to the next episode of the Impact Policy Podcast. Today I'm joined by now new mate, Jared Wheatley. We connected in person, walking down the street together in the eastern suburbs towards the end of last year, and been sort of navigating similar spaces and circles and really looking for an opportunity to connect more. So thought what more of an opportunity to get than to get together and record some of that conversation as well. So I'm sure for people listening, they'll take a lot away from this personally, professionally, from a practice perspective as well. Before we get into the sort of depth of it, I want to take a moment to acknowledge country. I want to recognise that wherever you're consuming this content from today, you are on Aboriginal land, never ceded by treaty. And I want to pay my deepest respects to Bidjigal country, our elders past and present, and recognise that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. If you are following along, you have been for some time, you get some sort of value out of these podcasts, please share them with your networks. Please follow and subscribe to our channels. It helps us, share this message with more of the sector, more people that share our values and are committed to social change as well. So with that, I might take a moment to let Jared tell us a little bit more about himself, where he's from, his background, and how he's got to where he is today. Over to you, bro.
Yeah, thanks, man. It's nice to be doing this first conversation that we'll be like doing our first deep dive where it's kind of live. So, it's
Absolutely.
it's nice. I've been working for 17 years with kids, with young people. Since I was 17, got my first, did youth work certificates when I was in high school. That's the direction I've come at it through this, is just being like, just doing direct work has pretty much been in it, and pretty quickly realizing for me it wasn't work.
Yep.
That is, it's part of my life. And so I worked in a youth centre, which I ran as a service for 4 years, and then I was overseas working with refugees, so unaccompanied minors coming into Europe. And then came back and had a run of kind of startups, so small kind of youth-led charities that would kind of be using young people's skill set as the social venture to pay for them whatever the particular social good was.
Yeah.
That was a kind of a ride for a little while there with, these social enterprises were, kind of touted as kind of, so I was on that kind of swing for a while with kids. And I should say too, I was a kid myself. Like I was, 17 when I started kind of doing this work. But then, became more and more interested in finding where are the bits, like, a kid that's currently living in a hotel got very little ability to be able to advocate for a different system, and became more and more interested in the pointier end of our sector of where these kind of larger concepts around how we're going to care, how we consider ourselves and what our job is. But then you have things like professional distance that people have been able to maintain in, say, a clinical context, like a psychologist doing 1 hour of therapy a month is able to hold that professional distance, play a neutral role, not get close. But starting going, wait a second, we're raising kids in that culture.
Yeah.
And that didn't make a lot of sense to me.
Absolutely.
So it's been a progressive run, I think, through the social sector to get me to, I guess, what the pointiest end was for me of where you get these kids in by design relational deprivation. Like we've actually written the rules of the system to ensure that child is disconnected. It's not by chance, it's happened by design. Absolutely. And not because I think anyone is evil personally, that's not my interpretation. I don't think people have set out to do it. I think it's just that this system meets the system's needs so well that a lot of kids just get trapped in that while the system's meeting its own needs, and maybe has stated values around best interests of kids. But when you just straight observe what our system does, I think it acts in its own self-interest.
Yeah.
And so, my journey's just been through the social sector, kind of 17 years working directly, and kind of found myself at this pointy end of out-of-home care, trying to get kids out of anywhere where they're cared for by shift workers. That's the kids I'm trying to reach and get back into community, get back into homes. Then on the broader scale, last December with quite a few others set up the Centre for Relational Care. So looking to say it's not just good enough to kind of be at that end of the system trying to get kids back into connection and get the attuned adults in their life the number up. We also got to do the work to say what's going on culturally here in the sector. What are these kind of big barriers to relational models? What are the barriers to actually handing power over to ACOs? What are the barriers, and how do we all play whatever role we can to say we've got to address what's this underlying sector culture that is prioritizing the bureaucracy before our humanity, that has people kind of spending 80% of their time doing paperwork, yet we're all saying we're doing this for the best interests of kids.
Absolutely.
Or like, understanding itself through all these kind of measurements that we'd never do for our own families.
Totally.
I've never rocked up and said, hey, a case plan is going to be the way I'm going to care for my daughter.
Yeah.
Like that's kind of, it's a form of, I just don't understand how we've convinced ourselves that these systems are going to A, tell us who we are and how we should work, but B, that we think they're going to be good tools for actually listening and helping.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I think it's like kind of like that paperwork versus time with people. I think it's the methodologies, how we evaluate, what KPIs we set, how we commission. But I think it's also this coming at it from a perspective of saying if we want real connections and relationships in the sector, we also have to have a look at our boundaries and interrogating that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach to boundaries.
Absolutely. Sounds like you've really dived deep from that out-of-home care perspective, from a practice level to a systems level in terms of that sort of thinking and how you've moved into that sort of space. What's that looked like in terms of, you said you had a 17-year journey in the sector. Where's the bulk of this out-of-home care sort of stuff grown out of? Has it been that frontline work? Has it been more...
Yeah, so it was 2011, or I was over in Germany working with unaccompanied minors that had certain rights within the German out-of-home care system. So I was just getting my head around what their system is and how you could advocate for young people. That I was actually working in a school at the time, so it wasn't in out-of-home care. But I saw models that were operating there that weren't coming from the same perspective. They weren't coming from the same cultural legacy that we had here in Australia. And of course it's a very different one in Germany, but it just probably gave me that experience of saying it's up for grabs. These are things that can change. It doesn't have to be this way. And then I think coming back to Australia, I was having a lot of conversations with existing providers being like, you guys should run this or run programs in different ways. It's probably a little naive. I thought that because the sector talks about so much about if you can be cheaper, if it's cost effective and it gets better outcomes, then we want to do it. And I thought, I probably I spent 2 years of my life asking people, saying there's different ways to do this that will be cheaper and will get 100% guarantee better outcomes. Not because it's a magic bullet, but just because if you invest in connections and relationships for kids, like the neuroscience super clear, you got to let them drop out of hypervigilance.
Totally.
That fight, flight, freeze response, and actually someone who's going to put their hand on that kid's shoulder and go, hey mate, I got you. And we're not going anywhere.
Absolutely.
Those are the moments you're looking for, and you do that, I'm 100% sure we'll get better outcomes and it'll be cheaper. But it was really hard to overcome barriers like fears around industrial relations actions and those type of barriers that if we said, what if there's no timesheets in how we look to engage with family? And people go, that's undoubtedly better for family, it's undoubtedly better for the kid, but people go, whoa, what are we going to do with the legal aspects? So I spent 2 years asking other people to do it, and once I realised that I wasn't going to get very far, I set up my own organisation to go and do that as a bit of a proof of concept to then try and show that we can work in that way. And I'm certainly not the only one that's working relationally, of course, but just to use an example at the pointy end of the system to say it doesn't have to be this way. And so then, when I set it up, I was literally the only staff member because it was just me. So I did everything, I did it with the families, with the kids, with the system, I did it all. But, now we have about 100 people working with us. So it was still probably, I don't know if we're the smallest, but it would still be one of the smaller providers out there. But we're certainly a lot larger than it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, unreal. What a journey. Hope you're enjoying the next episode of the Impact Policy Podcast. Impact Policy is a social policy consulting firm. We work closely with the public sector around navigating some of the most complex social policy challenges we're experiencing today. Our team specialise in co-design, engagement, research and evaluation, and communications. If you want to speak to the team about how we might be able to partner, collaborate together, and do some great work, you can reach out directly to myself, sam.johnson@impactpolicyau.com. You can check out our website for more detail, impactpolicyau.com. And you can follow us on LinkedIn and stay up to date and subscribe to our free newsletter and everything else that's happening across Impact Policy HQ. All right, now let's get back to the episode. And what, in terms of, you talk about so much of that complexity in terms of trying to navigate that systems change sort of work, and then shifting that energy into, building a proof of concept model in terms of what that sort of stuff can look like in practice. What do you see the future looking like in terms of where we're progressing?
There's probably, on an honest level, I go, it's so difficult to shift paradigms, because I think at the heart of this, it's not like, I don't think there's a new practice framework or a new form that government can bring out, or a new piece of regulation that can shift what we're dealing with.
Yeah.
I think it's a paradigm shift that's needed. It's a different mentality. And so I think realistically, I say, just like you said at the start of the podcast, it's about finding like-minded people with a set of values that are trying to echo and support each other's voices to call for this. It's trying to create a sense for government that there is an alternative. I think it's very easy to stick with what you've got if there's not an articulated alternative that's being presented. And of course, First Nations advocates have been saying that for a long time. It's like, no,
Absolutely.
Shift agency over.
Absolutely.
And let us get on with self-determination. But I think it's about coming at it through all kinds of angles to hit it to government to say there are viable alternatives. At the same time, though, I think you've got to shine a light to make the status quo not palatable, because I think there is a sense of we've accepted that we can, in the system, that there's going to be group homes or hotels with 8-hour shift workers raising kids. And of course, it starts all the way back from a protection mindset. Absolutely. From how you're going to engage with families in the first place. Like, do you have a child protection system, or do you have a child connection system that's looking to connect families and kids? I think that's that part for me of trying to be like, what do I think the future looks like? I think it's about presenting viable alternatives for government. At the same time, I think it's about showing that the status quo isn't palatable. So we've got to keep turning the heat up on saying, no, we don't accept this for our kids. We don't accept that children are raised in those concepts. Absolutely. I would never allow it for my children. And I'd say that there wouldn't be anyone in the system that would want the system to come in contact with their family. And we've got to ask ourselves why that is. I don't think there's many industries that are less interested in how the direct beneficiaries think about the system. And just like a really crystal clear example of that is going, right now we don't ask families, is that helpful? We don't ask kids, is this helpful? Just as a base metric of going, we can do that. That's a really practical step of just starting to ask people, is this helpful?
Absolutely.
What would you like?
Absolutely. Some level of agency or voice in the journey, hey? Yeah. It's, last year I came across, like, just in the community centre that I spend a lot of time in personally, a young person who was doing the same sports activity as my son. And who I thought was his dad, I said, oh, hey, like, little Johnny's doing great, and he's like, oh, and, completely breached little Johnny's confidentiality and just told me his whole story that, he was a kid that was living in this 24-hour hotel accommodation. And so anyway, we got to know this kid pretty well over, I'd say, close to 12 months that he was coming to the club. And it was heartbreaking. It was a different worker. Almost every time we would see him was a different person. But what you said, like that piece around connection, like a complete absence of any type of connection between that young person and those people that are, supposed to be there to be providing care. And what was, I talk about it because this kid lived on my street and I had no idea, because I'd met him, I hadn't seen him before, and then after about 2 months, gets even more tragic. His mum starts coming on a Saturday morning to watch him, and what I started to realise is, like, this is a supervised visit that I'm observing in this community centre.
Oh man,
yeah, and then I would get up and I would get in the car to drive on a Saturday morning to my son's sport, and I would see her at the bus stop, young mum, like, busting herself to come in for these visits, doing everything she can, but just watching, like, the absolute powerlessness, and shame. And I just had so much fucking respect for her to show up in those spaces where she had so little agency, where she knew that every movement and step that she was making was being judged. Her son had complex needs, and you know, for example, like me mucking around playing basketball, and I would like, you know, encourage like the mum, like, hey, come over, and like, you know, she'd come over and they'd shoot some shots, and we'd play a little muck around game of 3-on-3 or whatever. And I could see her, whenever her son might demonstrate something that was a bit of a challenging behaviour, I could viscerally feel the fear from her that she was being like assessed in terms of that connection with her child, and how that was being observed in that sort of space. And it's just fucking heartbreaking, man, to see that in practice, and to know that there's so many kids right now that are still in homes experiencing, you know, that sort of stuff as well. But from the family perspective as well, it's that surveillance piece, it's that agency piece or lack thereof that is some of the most sort of troubling as well. Yeah.
How do you think like that? Inviting someone to shoot some hoops, and you know, like, it's an offer, right? And it's like it's something human of going to that. What did you observe in dynamic shift when something comes into that little moment that is just kind of surveillance? And if everyone's kind of in their head thinking about what someone's thinking about me right now, it's pretty hard to be like, hey, this is my son, I'm having some time with my son. Yeah,
absolutely.
But what did you observe happen to the dynamic? Maybe, I don't know, did the worker kind of change at all? Did mum's kind of, you know, posture change? Like, what did you notice in just that bit of kind of human connection?
Well, in my head, I just sort of, you know, because like you, I'm an ex-youth worker and community worker, and in my head, I'm pretty sure that there's case notes of some sort or observations that are going to be made of some sort of how that session's gone. And so my feeling immediately was like, the more engaged she is naturally in this sort of stuff, in pro-social activity and behaviour, the more positively that's recorded and reported on, the more stronger that might make a case for restoration or other things later on down the track. But I could feel the anxiety because it's that hyper surveillance.
So you were actually doing the same thing, man. You were looking at how's the system going to record my interaction. So you were like going, hey, I'm going to do this like little human thing, but you were going,
knowing that there's something so much, all this other stuff is actually happening parallel to.
Man, that bit is like, it's invisible to so many people. Like going, what's the bandwidth one has to spend on that vigilance?
Totally.
And you know, it's like, I'm not saying you can't then really connect within that environment. You of course can. Humans,
absolutely,
you know, capacity to connect is kind of infinite. But you know, what has to happen in the system for that bandwidth to actually go to the thing that we desperately need it to go to, which is, you know, I see you, I'm here, I'm listening.
Absolutely. It's it's wild, you know. And I think like I try not to. It's a really valuable reflection personally, and I think it speaks to what the realities are for a lot of kids that are going through this. And I think you talk about the palatability of the out-of-home care space, and I was thinking about that this morning and recently as well, particularly around a lot of the commentary around the stolen generation. And because for me, I think that sort of feeds into this narrative that this sort of stuff is in the past. Whereas for me, like, the stolen generation never finished. It just, like, it evolved. And so I was even feeling this morning, like, because we've spent a lot of time with stolen generation organisations and survivors and our old people. We have family members in our team that are direct descendants of the stolen generations. And so we've spent a lot of really close time around hearing those stories and those experiences. And you know what, as tragic and as traumatic as they are, you know, one of the biggest things that is such a strength that comes through is the brotherhood of the men growing up as kids together. That's their brothers, you know, they always had each other. And very similar for the women as well. And I think what I feel and what I see with young people and what young people are experiencing today is like, you're even further isolated. So then we've got kids coming out of these systems that have been through, you know, similar compounding trauma of forced removal from all cultural backgrounds as well, but a real lack of any type of connection with other people in those spaces. And I posted something up a while ago saying, and it's true, like when I meet any other human who's had a lived experience of forced removal, I feel this immediate connection with them that I really struggle to articulate. It's this knowing, it's this feeling that you know that you both share. And so for many survivors of the system, for many young people still in there that are isolated and alone, I think that's the compounding experience we're navigating today is from a cultural perspective, and I mean no disrespect to our survivors of the stolen generation, but I never think it finished. It's simply evolved, and if anything, what's even more tragic is how much more alone a lot of our young people are, Aboriginal young people, but all young people in the system as well. And I think those hotel examples that you're really dialing in on are a perfect example of what highlights that too.
Yeah, it's crazy because no one wants it to land there, right? Like you speak to any advocate in the system, government, like there's everyone saying we don't want children in those environments.
Absolutely.
And yet that's what happens. And
totally.
It's a pretty steady stream. I don't know, like listening to what you're saying there about going that, like, why is it evolved? And, I think there's, I can kind of hear voices in my head going, well, that colonial mentality is going to find ways to keep living, and that's a cultural perspective or cultural lived kind of culture there. So that's one thing I was thinking of, but I was also thinking of something that I've been wrestling with a lot when I was listening to you speak about going, what keeps us there? And I think this idea of protection is something to dial in on. Like it's there on the label as a child protection system, which you could go, hey, the intentions of that, everyone wants to see happy, healthy kids, and you can see it through that lens, that paradigm, and going, it's about we're here to protect and help.
Definitely.
But then you can see it through another lens, going like, oh, wait a second, if you got Australian maltreatment study going, hey, you got 20 or 30% of Australian communities that are going to struggle with certain moments of their life. Doesn't mean all the moments are like that, but there's going to be moments in a lot of families that aren't going to be what we want to see for kids. But then is the right response to 20 or 30% of our community, we're going to come in and have surveillance and protect your kids? Or, so I think there's something in shifting there around our base assumption of does the community expect government to be able to come in and protect? If so, that's going to be a tough gig for any government, because I just don't think you'll ever, even if that worked, which it doesn't, but even if it did work, you would never scale it to meet the prevalence of families that are struggling at times.
Absolutely.
So you need a different perspective that I go, because, I think it has evolved, I agree with you, but then, how do you intervene with that? And I go, wonder if one of these like foundational stories for the system is still sees itself as the one that will hold the agency and the power to be able to come and protect. But it's a power that we don't have. No one has. And it's damaging then if the government kind of says, I can do this. And it's also if the community expects the government to do it. There's a bit of a contract going on there that I think can make it harder to break out of that and truly embrace different ways of being with families, as long as that protection mentality stays as the core belief of the story about ourselves.
Absolutely. I often think about how we can, reimagine a narrative where we see an investment, in the justice space. I'm not sure if you're familiar with justice reinvestment and the concept of that model, and the idea that if you invest what funding would have been spent for people listening, into keeping, for example, kids in custody into a community that might be experiencing an issue around youth crime and offending, that is an economical investment and and a social investment, and you receive those social and economic benefits further on down the track. It's similar. Many of us with lived experience, but also practitioners, always talk about like, like if you paid my parents how much carers are getting and how much some of these other providers are getting to be able to provide access to, and some sort of support around that sort of stuff, to be able to access all these tools and resources to be able to care and be present and navigate their own healing and stuff like that. You probably really could have kept our family together. And how do we start to think about those sorts of ways that are thought of more as investments in our communities, as opposed to or why should certainly families be given more money than others, or why should different communities be treated differently to others? And
how's it going to play out if the newspaper reports on
absolutely.
X, Y, Z? But like, this is, I mean, I don't love this term, but like, broadly speaking, a public health approach. Let's move the money out from acute hospitals and let's move it into health in the community. And you go the same thing in justice, same thing in out of home care.
Totally.
How do you see more money invested in with families? So I don't think anyone will argue though that like that's a prudent economic move, and it's certainly a more humane. And I think it's also be very difficult to argue that there's not a kind of a moral imperative to have to do that. Like, I don't think you can really argue otherwise, to be honest. But you go, yet we won't, or we don't at the moment. Why do you think the barrier between everyone in the system I would speak to, I think, would agree with that point, that we need to shift the funding from here to here? What are your thoughts on why that doesn't actually happen, or hasn't happened, or doesn't happen significantly at the moment?
I think there's two thoughts that come to mind when I think from a funding and systems perspective. It's that idea of how we are so. It's so hard for us to, and I might use it loosely and people might interpret it differently, but decolonize our thinking around how we think about, funding, or how we think about how systems operate and engage with our people and communities. And so, like, I use education as an example. So we know that disconnection from mainstream education is a really early indicator of other stuff maybe happening and stuff like that as well. And but there's so little how we see these models operating is that if you don't fit within that model that we've designed, then then anything outside of that model is not viewed as what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that if you don't fit within a system that's been designed, and you sit out of that system, then you're seen as a problem or a challenge or an issue. And I think a lot of this stuff comes down to how we understand and respond to trauma, and how we understand and respond to complex needs, and how we need to recognise that when our systems are only designed to fit one type, and you've got diverse communities, diverse learners, people with complex health and well-being sort of stuff that sit outside of those gaps, it's really hard for us to think about funding for them that's not seen as problematic. And then it's really hard for us to actually think about, well, for example, the education, you go back to the education example, it's really hard for us as a system to start to think about, well, if we start investing in other models of education with public monies, what's that saying about the validity of these systems and structures that we've had in place for so long?
So you think it's like an admitting, like by funding in a different way, it inherently admits that our current system doesn't meet the needs of all the people that are coming into it, and it's kind of like it delegitimizes the current system by funding in a different way? Yeah,
absolutely. I think if you start to, and again using the education example, if you start to invest those resources into those spaces and those kids start to remain engaged, maybe start to flourish in whatever ways, and other young people that are from diverse backgrounds start to see those as great pathways and options from those sorts of perspectives, or families start to see that, it takes legitimacy away from the state and these systems that we've had in place for so long. But hey, look, that's just my personal perspective. But we see that massively with the reduction of investment into flexible learning programs in Australia. They operate in isolation and with little coordination, and they're often seen as an alternative or a fix for someone who is having a problem with a certain system, as opposed to a pathway for different communities and stuff like that too. But
that word problem, like seeing the kid as a problem, sorry, that it always interests me there of going, I had a mentor of mine once say, like, hey man, that's not a problem, that's a survival strategy. And man, like, again, the framing of that is going like, this was probably the best strategy this kid could take, like an amazing strategy to keep themselves as safe as possible based on their context. Totally different perspective. Then you're going, wow, what a strategy. Hey, we can look at that, we can be curious about it together, and with the youngster going, hey, where did that come from?
Absolutely.
But yeah, it's Yeah, I don't think anyone will argue with that kind of shifting it to earlier on. I think it's just while you've got systems that have imperatives. I don't think to the system it's a choice. Like, it can't currently, would we have a $3.2 billion roughly kind of budget coming out in New South Wales for out-of-home care?
Yeah.
And it's spending on a lot of programs that we know, what have we had, 14
Absolutely.
government-led inquiries since the 90s?
Yeah.
Saying it's not working.
Yep.
Anyway, don't, I take it everyone's going to be listening to this gets, it's not working, but we know it. But there's imperatives that the system currently feels like it can't not fund. So if you've got a kid in state care and they've had 50 foster care placement breakdowns, the state goes, we can't not fund this group home. That's how I think to the system. So I think it's how do you make the system incentives different so that the imperative changes? Because I know there's something in that for me of just going, like, when I go speak to the people that are in charge of those decisions, my experience is they're people that feel helpless.
Yeah,
they're people that go, man, my heart's breaking for this kid.
Yeah,
I feel like this is my only choice.
Absolutely, and I hear that, and I think you're really narrowing on some critical points for us to understand for context. I think there's a whole lot of work that's been happening at the moment around restoration and restoration task forces and getting kids back to families and stuff like that as well. And whilst I wholeheartedly support that sort of stuff as well, I think we're really missing a critical sort of point around, you sort of said, I don't know, before we even started rolling, around the kids shouldn't even be in these homes. So we need to, like, what's happening there. And, a big part of my contribution in the consultation around the restoration sort of work and that sort of conversation is that there's so much, like, once a kid there's such a process, significant process in terms of years before someone is often made a ward of the state. And so you've got once a kid is taken from their family, you do have a significant amount of time in terms of advocating for the family, providing agency, providing access to, legal support, representation, all that sort of stuff. That can really minimise the risk of a young person becoming a ward of the state or having conditions in place that are maybe more fit for purpose. And I talk about that from a personal perspective. Like, my sister was a ward of the state, and I was old enough to remember that journey. I think I was 19 by the time that order was made. And so I remember the day she was removed to the day she was a ward of the state, and they said she never came home. And I remember, look, it's okay, because I'm now at a point where I can communicate back that experience in a way that adds value. And the most tragic part was my parents' lack of agency, lack of support, mental health, addiction, complex needs, trauma, zero support around any of that sort of stuff, zero ability to participate in these processes from a cultural perspective, from a trauma-informed perspective, from all those sorts of factors. And so despite the fact that, and my sister was removed because of poverty, because of neglect, which we know is a grossly overrepresentation of many kids being taken from their families. And so, considering that in that context from a personal perspective, like and then sitting there in the courtrooms and watching my mum, who was, severely mentally ill, getting grilled in the witness stand by the lawyers for the state, who's clearly not well, getting made to look stupid, and watching this whole process pan out, I reflect back and just think, wow, if there was some sort of a task force that was designed to be invested in those families, to sit with them, to identify all those needs, build some sort of a process around them, and then be able to sit in those spaces and advocate and communicate and translate, and provide that level of agency to be able to participate in those processes. Like, man, maybe she wouldn't have been a ward of the state. Maybe she would have still been removed. Maybe there would have been some sort of a process in place. But the outcome would have been so much more positive had they had access, equity, inclusion, and justice in that journey. Yeah.
I'm totally aware. I don't know that family story and all of its complexity and nuance, but I'd go, my experience, generally speaking, is if someone had been there and said, hey, well, let's have a meal together first.
Yeah.
Let's just, like, everyone just stop for a second. Let's just, connect.
Yeah.
And then go on, I wonder, even if there was things like everyone I've ever met that ends up in the system still has uncles, still has aunties, still has grandparents, still has a whole lot of people that are with them.
Totally.
Still has ex-footy coaches that care. Still has ex-teachers that took that extra time.
Totally.
And so even if after all of that support, if someone could be there relationally and actually say, what can we do to help? What can we do to support, and listened? And even if the end result was saying, okay, we can all be connected still, but it's not here right now in this way, then there's just a myriad of other options that aren't a removal.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think so. For me, like, when we were talking just like on the way into this of going, it's absolutely we have to do that differently. But we also can't forget about the current kids that are sitting in the system and say we need to urgently get the number of attuned adults in their life up. And that to me is saying, how many adults, if that kid turns 18, are still there? If you get that number up, we'll see them held through connection and relationship, not through health plans and case plans and all the technical. So I think it's both at the same time.
Absolutely.
And linking them as part of, like, these aren't two separate advocacy charges, but they're part of the same alternative to the system, saying, a child connection system at both ends.
Yeah, absolutely.
And hopefully the goal is, like, when I hear you saying there's an advocate that can help them navigate that process, I mean, that's way better than what we do now. But I go, what would it look like if we didn't have mandatory reporting as we currently have? We're putting in 200,000 reports on families with surveillance and policing. What if we had a differential response that was saying, our job isn't to report, it's to support families in community and connection.
Absolutely.
But like, we weren't just putting in advocates to fight against that current tide, but saying these are structural things that can change, that we don't need to have a funnel or a pipeline pushing people towards statutory care and then advocates trying to pull kids out of that stream.
Totally.
We can change the stream. What the funnel, like, we can change it at the fundamental level right back at the start, but that requires a new act.
Yep.
I mean, there's so many amendments to the current one anyway, but you'd be like, repeal and replace the current act. Let's start again with a different cultural understanding.
Yeah.
I think that's the, you, in those moments of hope for me, I go, man, there's so many people that I think are in isolated pockets calling for such things. And it's just about trying to lend weight to those calls for action that are already out there in a lot of cases. And, just by listening and keep learning about relational approaches, I haven't found an area yet in the system, even if I'm working at that pointy end. In what I've been doing with the Centre for Relational Care is just a lot of listening the last year around different approaches. And everywhere I look, I'm like, it's the same thing. Like, as long as you're spending 80% of your time on paperwork, we're probably not going to have any time for people. And when they are rocking up to that family, they're probably just asking the questions they need to ask. They can get back to fill in that piece of paperwork. So unless we change these structural things, I go, that's how to stop the tide or the gravity pulling people back towards this kind of, these things that make the system safe but aren't actually felt. It's not going to change a lived experience. It's not going to change someone I feel different about how you're interacting with me.
Definitely.
I think that's the task.
Hope you're enjoying the episode of the Impact Policy podcast. Impact Policy is a social policy consulting firm. We work really closely with the public sector around navigating some of the most complex social policy challenges we're experiencing today. We specialize in co-design, engagement, research and evaluation, and communications. If you, your team, or someone you know needs to reach out to us to have a conversation in more detail about how we might be able to support you navigate your own social policy journey, you can follow us along on LinkedIn. You can subscribe to the podcast here, and you can reach out to us directly at www.impactpolicyau.com. Enjoy the episode. Absolutely. You talked earlier about those stats around just generally that a family will experience some type of hardship in Australia at any point in time. It was like 20 or 30% of families at some point in time will experience some sort of a challenge or a hardship and stuff like that. And it just made me think when you're talking about what you're talking about then in terms of how we start to rethink community care and what community care looks like in our communities outside of thinking about it from a deficits perspective and really building strong and connected communities that aren't, rooted primarily in issues around disadvantage. And I think about this, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of First Nations Response. They're based in, they were born out of the COVID lockdown, just in terms of how to respond to what was happening and how to care for elders and family and all that sort of stuff. But it's really, really grown over since then into this community care model. So they primarily work in the food security space. But what they report on is that food security community care model ends up providing a platform for all this other stuff that we're talking about now. How do you keep families supported and well when you can see that they're struggling? How does that flow on to reducing the risk of... Yeah.
I hear so many terms for that are currently missed in the system, like social cap, there's a lot of fancy terms you hear, like social capital. I was reading another book the other day, what was it calling it? Anyway, but there's terms like, that's currently invisible to the system of when, and we almost see it as like the side bonus, but we don't really understand it. We don't see it as central. And I think a big part of that is the system's always going to do what it measures.
Yeah.
And that's the stuff that's not as tangible. So, if you'd ask any one person in their life, what's the most important thing to you? And they're going to say, it's my family, friends, belonging, might be religion, purpose. And you say, can you prove it? Do you have a checklist for it? Do you have a measure that you can track the numbers for it? And if the answer is no, does it make it any less meaningful? And the answer is, of course, no. This is still what I want to orientate my life around. And I think our systems are in a trap of, it relieves adult anxiety because we go, hey, we're funding, we want to know what works. And so you need to show us the numbers and the data. And you can do that on, we deliver X amount of food. But it's a lot harder in this current system to prove what was the moment when you stopped before you delivered the food where someone shared about they couldn't get the kid to the X appointment and someone else says, I know someone else that can take them. That's not tangible in the system. And I think one of these other powerful tools I'd love to see for systems change is about how you try and illuminate that by asking those questions that aren't just quantitative, but they're qualitative. They're saying, what matters most to the people that matter most?
Absolutely.
Because I think that's currently somewhat invisible to the system, yet anyone that's had experience to the systems instantly knows, are they dealing with a culture that's orientated towards KPIs, that's orientated towards, the numbers, or is it orientated towards them saying, hey, is this working? And a lot of that doesn't need to be formal. It's not an annual questionnaire that you send out. It's because if you're in connection and relationship, you're hearing that feedback.
Absolutely.
So I think it's about, that's the visibility and, I'd go, that's the methodology. Like I'd say that's how I've been speaking a lot when I'm talking with government, etc., about saying we can choose a methodology that orientates us towards the people we claim to be here to represent and help. But our current methodology is understanding ourselves through measurement, which tends to only look at behaviour. And once you're working on that behaviour level of trying to shift behaviour without addressing the core of what your job is, in my opinion, which is connection, we're going to miss... It doesn't matter what program we design, as long as we keep orientating people in that direction.
That's it. Well, the behaviours are symptoms, right?
Totally.
It's the other stuff that's going to have the impact of addressing what's going on. I think you touched on some really critical things that we're trying to work on. So we do a lot of work at Impact Policy around co-design. So, government, community, we work together to design, projects, whatever that might look like. But one thing we're really trying to champion now is, particularly when we work for the public sector, is about co-designing what an evaluation looks like. Co-designing from the forefront what success looks like, and doing that with the communities that we're designing together for. And that's a new conversation. People are like, oh, hang on a second, like we're funding this, we will evaluate. And it's everything you talked about, everything in terms of exactly the conversations that we're having in terms of understanding what success looks like from a qualitative perspective, looking outside of what primary sort of metrics might look like, and understanding the broader impacts of what this means for our communities. Too often we hear, and I'm sure you've heard it throughout your career, a really great project happens in community or it's piloted, and you can see some real potential with what's happening, and then it gets defunded because not enough metrics to satisfy reinvestment and stuff like that as well. And then what we hear time and time again though is like our community saying like, no, like we want to keep this because, you know, you might have only reported that 8 families that accessed that program, but we know that that access led to X amount of our broader families being able to get A, B, and C as a result of that service. So that's what we're really trying to give some agency back to our communities as part of that co-design journey to build in exactly what you said, like those conversations around what success looks like.
Yeah,
it's critical.
Couldn't agree more. And I use some examples where I go, when I'm talking to people about this, where I go like, I've never met a young person out of home care said, Jared, I wish people would do more case notes on me.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Totally.
I've never met a youngster that said, oh, you know what changed my life was this great risk-benefit analysis someone did for me when I was 15.
Totally.
Like, if you like, this is super basic. If you're listening to people that are in this system, affected by the system, that I mean children, I mean families, I mean frontline workers, because they're caught up in this too.
Absolutely.
And you ask them what helps or doesn't help, and you're straight away orientated in a different direction. And I'm yet to hear anyone affected by the system being like, I'd like more paperwork, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, so I think for people listening along, you know, I think that there's so much value that people can take away in terms of how we've tried to sort of navigate a lot of, you know, really some of the biggest social challenges we're navigating as a society today when we think about our children and young people. I think many people that are professionals can take away some critical stuff that can add value. I think many people that are sort of new to this sort of space can really start to understand it a bit more deeper. You mentioned you're speaking next week or you're coming up, you're going to a conference soon, or was that recently?
Oh no, I think I was chatting about the Child Protection Conference up in Brisbane in June. But always kind of cruising around and trying to speak about this. And I think a big part of that is just forming coalitions as much as possible around, you know, I've been calling it a child connection system rather than a child protection system. And so much of that is just backing in the voice that have already been there for a long time, but just reiterating what does it look like to transfer control and power and agency. What does it look like for us to say, you know, to kind of deconstruct some of those things that are holding us in place with these models. And so I think that's the work for me more in the Centre for Relational Care, of just trying to promote any relational model. And of course, you know, that's a big part of that is trying to back in the calls from First Nations advocates and ACOs that are embedded in community, that do have place-based knowledge, solution, cultural capital, all of those things. And trying to be another kind of voice when I speak about these things at conferences, about trying to put some language to it that I think is helpful to hear in a number of different ways from different directions and different people. And I think it's for the Centre for Relational Care of, you know, presenting, like I said, that there is an alternative to this system. We don't have to have a child protection system. It can be a child connection system. And saying that a lot of the knowledge is already there. This doesn't need to be like you're talking in like co-design. You know, we're not starting from nothing. There's a huge amount of wisdom and knowledge already there.
Absolutely.
And about how do we package that in a way that's palatable for government to see this is something we can viably turn to. And from there, it's how does the money move in the system and commissioning and power and a lot of other stuff. But I'm just saying that in the first iteration, it's about how do you create there like being a feeling of a wave coming of relational care, rather than it just being isolated organisations doing pockets of this work.
Absolutely.
But how do you kind of lend weight as much as you can to other people that are doing the relational work, call that out, and help the government and help the sector see it as a viable alternative to the current paradigm?
Definitely. If you had a key message for a practitioner listening that's working in the sector, maybe they're new, maybe they're on their journey, maybe they've been there for a while and they're really struggling, what would you sort of say to them in terms of, anything?
Yeah, I'd say firstly, a good lens just to take on saying, what if this was my child or a niece or a nephew?
Yep.
I think that's the first basis of just saying, like, this is deeply human work. This isn't, like, if you're coming into this sector and it's a job, you have to realise this isn't a job to the person on the other side. This is their life. So saying, first instance, this is, like, deeply human and deeply important. It's sacred if you're going to step into that space. And I think it's about, first iteration about not seeing them as a client or through these clinical medical lenses of intervention, but first seeing that that's a human and you're a human and connections at the heart of that. And I think interrogating their boundaries. So I've got different boundaries with my daughter than I do with a friend's daughter, than I do with a stranger daughter. And about understanding, hey, if you're there for 6 months and you're saying, oh, how do, I get this from some people, like, how do I build a relationship? First thing I ask is, should you be?
Yeah.
What role are you playing?
Totally.
And let's look at that based on your context of what's the most useful role you can play to serve and be present. But, I know that if you are lucky enough to be in a position where you can offer a real connection, that's where I see the most powerful work. And those relationships don't time out just because your contract ends. They're real human connections. And I've got nothing against clinical medical work. I think in a clinical and medical context, that makes absolute sense. But if you're talking in a community context or raising children, I don't think it does. So that'd be the main advice I'd say to someone entering the sector, is to understand the role you're playing and look at it critically, not through a one-size-fits-all approach, but a contextual approach that's seeing that relationship is the heart of our work, and seeing that the other people, not othering it, of going that you're going to be doing as much listening. And if you're present, like, time will work with you and it will be probably enough. I think I'd encourage people to on that. I'm saying, if you're willing just to be there and you got an open heart to that, people will feel it.
Definitely.
And you won't be able to fake it.
That's it.
You get that bit right, the rest of it is probably knowing how to navigate the system and keep yourself sane and all those things. But I think that would be what I'd say at the heart of it, man, is just like, what if this was your niece or nephew? How would you like to see them? What would this moment be? And there's just infinite ability to find those little moments where you can go, I see you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really powerful. I think that's really going to hopefully translate with a lot of practitioners that are hearing or seeing you talk to that. I think it it reminds me, like, one of my best Christmas I ever had when my sister was in care, and she would have been about 9, so about 2 years she was in care. And my parents had hardly seen her. They had the minimal, I think it was 4 supervised visits a year. And, it might have changed now, but back then they're in this tiny little white room, very super clinical. My mother would go to them, and there's no space to foster connection really outside of it's very clinical sort of space. Anyone who's feeling what I'm feeling, if you're a practitioner listening, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Anyway, after a while the connection just died, and my sister had bounced through 10 plus caseworkers, and then this amazing caseworker called Pip came, and she was at the latest stage of her career. Maybe don't want to insult her, she'd be a lot older now, this is 20 years ago almost, but she would have maybe been in her 40s, maybe 50s. She said, I used to work in the sector when I was young. I couldn't do it, burnt me out, I left. I've worked in the community sector for a long time, now I've come back. She said, Sam, I noticed that your parents haven't had a visit with your sister for a long time. My assessment is that, I think it could probably be appropriate for us to facilitate a supervised visit. How would you like to do it in the park? I was like sitting there going, 2 years, no one's ever had this conversation with me. And I'm like, do you reckon your parents would be up for that? And I was like, yeah, wow, yeah, I think they might. She goes, what about Christmas Day? I was like, fucking what? Okay. So she goes, mate, I'm just going to sit. I'll talk to it generally because I will get upset. But she goes, mate, I'm just going to sit up under a fucking tree with a book. You guys just do what you're going to do. Spend it how you're going to spend it. And but I won't talk anymore about it because I'll get upset. I don't want to get upset. But what I will say is that was such a great example of what you talk to when you talk about the message for practitioners that are listening. It's such a great example of how someone maybe has looked at a policy or a standard and thought, how can I make this work in the best possible case for this young person? And has had a significant and profound impact on that young person and their family. So I think, I'll leave it there with that point, but I think it reinforces what you're saying, that I think many practitioners can probably hear, connect with, and maybe lean into a little bit as well. I away from that sort of personal perspective, you clearly have such a depth of ability to understand and navigate this space systemically as well. What's one message that you would leave for leaders, decision makers, from that space as well?
I'd still look at it through a relational lens of going, for those people that are in those positions, have probably spent a career dedicating themselves and towards trying to help. And however, I think the key task, the further you are away from that moment that you're talking about of being there in a park, like that is that is such a sacred moment to go, how am I going to hold this? What role do I play? The further you're on, the more space you got from that, the higher my expectation grows for the ability for us to be able to critically look at what is this system and what role do we play. And I think it's seeing ourselves all in that. So I'm not saying this from a judgmental point of view. I'm in it too. It's not coming at it from a point of saying one party has this magic solution, I don't have it. But I would challenge, I guess, people in those positions are going, where are our stated values not living up to our lived values? So we've got a system that says we're doing everything that's in the best interest of the child, yet no one would really claim that spending 80% of our time on paperwork's in the best interest of any child. Yeah. Certainly not how we would raise our children and those leaders would raise their children at home. So I think the questioning or the message there would just be about saying everyone's welcome on a relational approach and no one's cut out of that. Everyone's welcome into it. However, we have to call out areas in our system where our approach isn't living up to our values. And looking at what can we do to bridge that gap. And that's more about how do you address the loss in the system. And I think the loss in the system is often loss of security to the legal entity. So a lot of these organisations would say, we're great with sitting with risk because what they're sitting with is risky, but putting on the risk on the organisation and not valuing the risk of relational deprivation, that's the risk that needs to be held most high. And that means there has to be a loss in security sometimes for an entity. Now, ironically, it makes it overall a lot safer because people are connected and doing better. But I think for organisations, it's about saying, how am I going to flip that ratio of that my people have got their time to spend on this? How am I going to change those evaluation frameworks? How am I going to actually have mechanisms where I'm listening to people affected by my service to find out if this is helpful? And I'd also say we can cut out, what if the best innovation in out-of-home care or community support was free and available right now? And it's relationships. And saying that right now they probably have contracts for their staff that are saying once you leave the job, you can't speak to that child. They probably have rules around a one-size-fits-all approach to boundaries, saying that after 5 o'clock, they have to call the after-hours number. Looking at those, there's such easy innovation that's free and available to those organisations right now to have a different perspective of their relational posture.
Definitely.
And so, that's what I'd say for those leaders is saying live values versus your stated values. And how do we move the dial about saying enabling real connections wherever possible? And some of those things are low-hanging fruit. Look at your contracts. Look at the direction you're giving to staff.
Totally.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I love that. And finally, if you had a message for a young person that might be in out-of-home care at the moment, maybe they're a survivor, maybe they've recently exited the out-of-home care system. We know that there's a range of amazing young advocates recently out of that sort of space. I'm sure you've been connected with them throughout your journey. If you got a message for them, what would you leave them with?
I'd leave with a message of just respect, of saying, often reflect on this, I go, nothing I'll ever achieve in my life, I really believe this, nothing I'll touch in my life will be more powerful than what a young person has to go through coming through out-of-home care and having to believe and find relationships and rewire their brain to say, no, I will choose to believe in those connections and be vulnerable and open myself up. And I go, anyone that's gone through that has achieved more than I'll ever achieve in my life. And so I think it would just be a posture for those people about going, that's a huge resource. It might not feel like it right now or in this moment, but there's something in that no one will ever be able to touch. There's something in that will be this guiding force and a strength for you to say what you've done is massive. And I'll go before there's any other expectations, just about recognizing that, going, mate, I see you, and what a champion, you know.
Yeah.
And none of that's, you know, it's not clean. This stuff has so much pain. And I think for people that have gone through that have felt that pain and touched that pain, no one, I certainly wouldn't claim to understand it, but I can see it and have a human reaction to it and go, mate, I see it and I respect you. And, you know, ideally it's people in their life that around them say, I'll be here to hold you and play a role in that. And no one's got, I certainly don't, a role to fix that pain, but I think there is definitely a different posture about being with them in that, and not presuming to know the right way forward, but just saying, I see you, mate, and I'm here for you in whatever way I can be.
Absolutely. I think you really, I think, you know, I can't have much more to that, brother. That's very powerful. And I think my only, you know, 2 cents on top of that, as a survivor of that sort of space, is for anyone listening or watching, is to remember that you are a survivor, to have that mindset and remember that if you've come through the other end of that and you're still here, then there's nothing that can get in your way. So just keep moving forward, you know, keep believing in yourself, and there's a reason why you're still here as well.
Amen.
I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come down, give up your time to share this space, have these conversations.
Thanks for having me, man.
The passion radiates through, the knowledge and expertise radiates through. I think so many young people are, you know, blessed to have someone like you driving the work that you're driving in this sort of space. And I think hopefully you're a big part of the puzzle as we navigate where we go to from here, brother. So
cheers. Good to chat.
Look forward to many more conversations, and you know, hopefully we get you back on as a friend of the Impact Policy podcast in the future.
I'd love to.
Awesome.
Cheers,
Thanks,
man.
bro. Cheers.